Commission will come to order, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for being here. Gao Zhejiang's account for the torture he experienced is shocking, offensive, and inhumane. From the time he was first arrested in 2006 until his provisional release in 2014, Mr. Gao was regularly hooded and beaten, shocked with electric batons, had toothpicks inserted in his genitals, was sleep-deprived and malnourished, and his life was threatened repeatedly by guards and fellow prisoners. Mr. Gao was tortured because he dared to represent persecuted Christians and Falun Gong practitioners, and because he was critical of the China's legal system. Gao wanted what was best for China, but he got the worst. Mr. Gao's wife, again he, submitted testimony to this hearing, and I urge all of you to read it. It's over on the side, and we'll make it a part of the record without objection. It is for Gao Zhejiang and the many other victims of torture that we are holding this hearing today. We are here today to shine a light on the brutal, illegal, and dehumanizing systemic use of torture in China. We shine a light in a dictatorship because nothing good happens in the dark, and we will learn, as we will learn today, there are some very dark places in China where torture is used regularly to punish and intimidate political and religious prisoners as well as their lawyers. We are also here to urge the United States government to make ending torture a higher priority in bilateral relations and to urge the Chinese government to fully enforce and implement its own laws. A country with China's global leadership aspirations should not engage in horrific practices so thoroughly condemned by the international community. As our witnesses will describe today in great detail, the use of torture is pervasive in China's detention centers and criminal justice system. Torture is used to extract confessions for prosecution and to coerce the televised public confessions we have seen so often in the past year. Torture is also used to punish those political prisoners the Chinese security forces view as destabilizing forces. Under President Xi Jinping, there has been an expansion in the number of individuals and groups viewed as threats to national security. The victims of torture are very often human rights advocates and lawyers, union activists, members of non-state-controlled Christian churches, Falun Gong practitioners, members of the ethnic minority groups like Tibetans as well as Uyghurs. Chinese officials repeatedly tell me I should focus more on the positive aspects of China's human rights and not on the negative. This is a difficult task when you read Gao Zhejiang's story or read the testimony of our witnesses, Golug Jigme and Yin Liping, who will present in just a moment. Nevertheless, I want to recognize that there are changes made recently to Chinese criminal procedure law that purports to prohibit the use of confessions obtained through torture and the requirement to videotape interrogations in major cases. According to Human Rights Watch, however, judges' videotaped interrogations are routinely manipulated, and police torture the suspects first and then tape the confession. And as Professor Margaret Lewis will testify today, and I quote, preliminary indications are, however, that recording interrogations is not significantly changing the culture of extreme reliance on confessions as the primary form of evidence in criminal cases. When I viewed an interrogation, she goes on, room in Beijing Police Station last October, the staff was to keep pointed out the video technology. I just have a misprint here, I'm sorry. What I could not help but notice was the slogan, truthfully confess that your whole body will feel at ease. They were looking down at this while they were sitting in the tiger chair. She says, faced with this slogan during prolonged questioning makes crystal clear to the suspects that there is no right to silence in Chinese law. Perhaps there may be Chinese officials who want to end the use of torture in detention facilities and curtail the force and influence of the Public Security Bureau. Their efforts should be encouraged and, of course, supported. But as with many other things in China, particularly in the realm of human rights, with each step forward or seemingly forward, there's often a step back and sometimes two. China's laws are too often either selectively implemented or completely ignored by security forces and the courts. Security forces faced with the end of labor camps created new forms of extralegal detention, such as black jails or residential surveillance in an undisclosed location, where torture can continue without oversight or interruption. Until suspects have lawyers at interrogations, until all extra-legal detention centers are abolished, and police and public security forces are held accountable for abuse, China's existing laws will continue to be undermined by existing practice. The U.S. government must find effective ways to address this issue urgently at the highest levels, because hundreds of thousands of China's people are victims of shockingly cruel, illegal, and inhumane activities. Last week, the White House said that President Obama reiterated America's unwavering support for upholding human rights and fundamental freedoms in China. President Obama has only a couple of more meetings with Xi Jinping before his administration ends. He should make ending torture a priority. This issue touches on so many other human rights issues that are also critical ones for U.S. economic and security interests in China, like protecting the rights of political prisoners, the right of due process and the arrest of human rights lawyers, curtailing police powers, and the expansion of national security laws to include peaceful reform advocates, encouraging an independent judiciary, protections for the freedom of expression and religious freedom, and encouraging establishment of the rule of law in China. Torture will not end until the price of bad domestic policy is too high for Chinese leaders to ignore, or Chinese leaders understand that the use of torture harms their global interests. It already absolutely harms their standing in the world, and both the UN and the Special Rapporteur's report, which again, like the previous one, is a scathing indictment of the Chinese systematic use of torture. President Obama should not only hesitate to name names and shine a light on horrific practices that the Chinese government says it wants to end, nothing else. Doing so would bolster the spirits of those prisoners of conscience who are rotting in Chinese jails. I'll never forget when I first met Wei Jingshang in Beijing in the early 1990s, when he was briefly let out of prison in order to get Olympics 2000, which they did not get. And then they rearrested him and tortured him some more. He said, "You Americans and the world does not understand that when you kowtow to the Chinese leadership, when you are afraid to look them in the eye and speak boldly about human rights, they beat us more in the prisons. But when you're predictable and strong and you have a resolve that they know is real, they beat us less." It gets right down to the level of the jails. As a Washington Post editorial concluded last week, private discussions about human rights are important, but so is public messaging. Autocrats and dictators need to know unequivocally that the United States sees the freedom of expression, religion, rule of law, transparency, and an end to torture as critical interests necessary for better bilateral relations and linked to the expansion of mutual prosperity and integrated security. I'd like to now call on our witnesses, and we will be joined shortly by members of the House and Senate. Two of our members are in a intelligence briefing, Marco Rubio, for example, but he is making his way over here, and we'll leave that shortly. So, again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. And without objection, your full statements and any information, additional materials you'd like to add to the record is made in order, and we will include it in the record of this proceeding. I'd like to begin with Professor Margaret Lewis, Professor of Law at Seton Hall University from my state, and welcome. Professor Lewis will discuss the Chinese government's track record in implementing criminal procedure reforms to prevent torture and the continuing use of extra-legal forms of detention, despite the abolition of re-education through labor in 2014. She will also talk about the unprecedented crackdown on human rights lawyers in July of 2015 that led to the interrogation and harassment of hundreds of lawyers and their families, as well as the recent arrest of at least 11 of them on state subversion and inciting state subversion charges, nebulous charges at that. Additionally, she will share observations regarding forced or coerced confessions extracted through mistreatment of criminal suspects, including in recent high-profile cases, including activist lawyers, booksellers, and others. I will then hear from Golag Jigme, a Tibetan Buddhist monk, a human rights advocate and survivor of torture in Chinese detention centers, now living in exile in Switzerland. Mr. Jigme will discuss his personal experiences of torture at the hands of Chinese authorities during 3 periods of detention, 2008 to 2009 and 2012, as well as broader issues regarding the treatment of Tibetans in detention. We'll then hear from Ying Li-ping, a Falun Gong practitioner and survivor of torture in re-education through labor camps, now living in the United States after having been accorded refugee status in December of 2015. Ms. Ying Li-ping will discuss her personal experiences of torture at the hands of Chinese authorities during 3 periods, 1999, 2002, and 2004. Then finally, no stranger to this commission or to another committee I chair, the Human Rights Committee of the Foreign Affairs Committee, is Sophie Richardson, and we welcome her back, who is the China Director of Human Rights Watch. Dr. Richardson will address documented cases in pretrial detention and problems with access to lawyers and medical treatment that were featured in Human Rights' May 2015 report and others, and on the devices known as tiger chairs and many other aspects relating to that. She will also comment on the UN Committee Against Torture's concluding observations in the Chinese government's participation in international human rights mechanisms. Dr. Richardson will provide policy recommendations to the Commission, and all the others, of course, are welcome to do so as well as to the United States government. And without objection, we are including written testimony by Gang Gonghu, wife of human rights lawyer Gao Zhejiang, as I mentioned earlier, as someone that this Commission and me and many of my colleagues have followed and spoken out repeatedly on his behalf. We will hear or put her testimony into the record. So, Professor Lewis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am privileged to be invited to participate in this hearing, and I also need to say that having worked closely with your staff on the 2015 annual report, that I saw firsthand what an exceptional group of people you have supporting this commission. In addition to these brief opening remarks, I have submitted a more detailed statement that is available outside. I want to begin by recognizing that China is undertaking a sizable basket of reforms having to do with criminal justice. And it is understandable that these reforms will take time to implement, both because of resource constraints and because of the entrenched practices of the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. These transitional challenges are fundamentally different, however, from the government's decision to selectively ignore legal protections embodied both in Chinese law and international legal norms. Here lies the key problem. The Chinese government places perpetuating one-party rule above a robust commitment to the rule of law and human rights. For example, it is extremely rare for a court to use procedures in the criminal procedure law for excluding illegally obtained evidence. Admittedly, courts should rarely have to exclude evidence if police and prosecutors are doing their jobs and not relying on illegally obtained evidence. That said, ongoing concerns about the court's unwillingness and even inability to stand up to the police, coupled with personal accounts of coerced confessions, stretch the bounds of credulity that the careful work of police and prosecutors is what's responsible for the rare invocation of these rules. PRC criminal procedure law also provides that no person shall be found guilty without being judged as such by a court. But the nearly 100% conviction rate in China underscores that the determination of guilt in practice occurs before a defendant enters a courtroom. Any movement towards establishing a real presumption of innocence has been further undermined by the disturbing practice of televised confessions, effectively replacing formal court proceedings with public shaming. One of the more encouraging recent developments in criminal procedure reform has been the use of audio and video recordings of interrogation in serious cases. It is not yet of all cases. Preliminary indications are, however, that the recording of interrogations is not significantly changing this culture of relying on confessions as the primary, if not sole, form of evidence in criminal cases. And as the chairman noted, when I was fortunate to visit a police station in Beijing, I was excited to see that there was videotaping technology, and the staff was very quick to point this out. What they did not point out, but what I could not help but notice, was literally written in the floor right in front of the constraining metal interrogation chair was the saying, 如实坦白, 一身轻松, literally, if you confess, your whole body will feel at ease. And this is what a suspect faces while they are undergoing prolonged interrogation by the police. So there is no right to silence currently under Chinese law. The value of interrogation recordings is further limited if the defense has a difficult time accessing those recordings, or if there simply is no defense lawyer, which is the case in most cases today in China. Suspects need lawyers both to understand their rights and then to have someone actually advocate for those rights. Yet the Chinese government is taking an increasingly hostile stance towards defense lawyers. Defense lawyers risk reprisals by the government rather than praise for their contributions to the rule of law. Turning to forms of detention outside of the formal criminal justice system, a variety of measures persist despite the end of re-education through labor. While forms of so-called administrative detention, like compulsory drug treatment centers and custody and education centers, have at least some basis in Chinese law, they do not satisfy international requirements for the legal review that must precede long-term deprivation of a person's liberty. The Chinese government also takes actions without any legal basis to silence voices perceived as threatening to the existing political structure. The fact that extra-legal measures like black jails are not officially recognized complicates efforts to estimate their prevalence. The Committee Against Torture stated that it, quote, remains seriously concerned at consistent reports from various sources about a continuing practice of illegal detention in unrecognized and unofficial detention places. This concerning state of affairs leads to the question, what are the implications for U.S. policy? I encourage U.S. policymakers to think of efforts to improve human rights in China on 3 levels: multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral. Multilaterally, engaging China through international bodies like the UN Committee Against Torture emphasizes that China is being judged by the yardstick of international human rights norms, to which China has voluntarily subscribed, not by standards imposed on China by the United States or any other country. Bilaterally, the official U.S.-China human rights dialogue and the slightly less official legal experts dialogue are important forums, though I think we must keep our expectations very modest for the ability of these forums to actually spur legal reform right now in China. Non-governmental organizations and American universities further serve an important role in organizing meetings between Chinese and American experts. Conversations with Chinese participants at these meetings restore my faith that there are many reform-minded people both inside the government and outside the government who are working to further criminal justice reforms. Building these interpersonal ties at these meetings is not an immediate deliverable, but instead this is going to lay the groundwork for a long-term cooperation after the current political winds may shift, whenever that may be. Finally, the increasing resistance by the Chinese government to engage meaningfully in discussions of human rights sometimes requires taking a unilateral stance. I was in Beijing when the government announced the trial date for the renowned civil rights lawyer Pu Zhiqiang on charges of inciting ethnic hatred and picking quarrels and provoking trouble through comments on his microblogs. The U.S. Embassy's request that a representative be able to attend the trial was, not surprisingly, denied. Undeterred, a senior diplomat stood outside the courthouse and read a statement expressing concerns about Mr. Pu's treatment. Literally taking a stand on the courthouse steps reaffirms to ourselves that, despite our own country's transgressions sometimes of human rights norms, we remain committed to the fundamental dignity and rights of all human beings. When President Obama addressed treatment of detainees in the aftermath of 9/11 at a 2014 press conference, he recognized that we tortured some folks. He continued that a detailed government report addressing instances of torture, quote, reminds us once again that the character of our country has to be measured in part not by what we do when things are easy, but what we do when things are hard. While in China last December, several Chinese scholars and practitioners suggested that we stop focusing so much on what they termed the exceptional cases, when there had been marked reforms to the criminal justice system as a whole. I responded that the character of China's criminal justice system has to be measured not just by the handling of relatively easy run-of-the-mill cases like petty thefts or assaults, but also by the blatantly politically motivated prosecutions, even if such cases represent a relatively small percentage of all criminal cases. The Chinese government's failure to live up to the legal standards that it sets for itself in these hard cases undermines the legitimacy of the entire system. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a statement, and I look forward to our discussion with the Commission.
Professor Lewis, thank you very much for your statement, and thank you for complimenting the staff of this commission, which are among the most knowledgeable and effective people. And our report, as you know, that comes out is so heavily footnoted. Almost half of it are footnotes because the research is so in-depth. And I compare that to what the Chinese government just did in their release on alleged human rights abuses in the United States, which we welcome. I mean, as you point out, and I did a VOA talk show this morning that was broadcasted to China, and some of the call-ins were critical of the U.S. policies, and I said, criticize away. You know, criticism helps when it's benign, especially when it's well-meaning and constructive, helps us to reform. But just to have a comeback to the human rights report issued by the U.S. Department of State, which was, again, a near scathing indictment of many of these practices that China's government engages in. You know, people are going to break laws, and you have to have due process rights, defense attorneys. So I thank you for your input to our work on that important report. I'd like to now recognize Golag Jigme, and thank you for being here today.
예, 정말 너네 뜻조건 소총당 너네 고적 안원권 너네 내 배배 소주가 정말한 참지 다시 대라제인.
I would first of all like to offer my heartfelt gratitude to Congressman Smith and members of the CECC and those gathered here.
너네 인가 말한 거 동지금 이제 나이나 네 제빈 답서 봐서 너네 시 조자체 봐서 long of Bazin Bichani, Marangoni, Jigri,
My name is Golok Jigme. I consider myself a freedom fighter. I consider myself a social worker and filmmaker. As a result of our making Living Fear Behind, we had some issues.
Tainang iterandane kacha chayande daga randane kacha ngarangnik dam jiram gotane narcho zon tangsamla chiyanti korum damara shakayin ta yiktogni karsan poyati yiktogni pewari tenji.
My written statement has already been submitted to you. What I would like to describe a little more is about the torture that I experienced during the 3 different detentions that I had to undergo.
지로 lon년도 리 고아 짐슨 강사 특성으로는 일동다 시행구 전에 원나는 로미 톱당당 다지가 마소지야당 로미 톱당제 자와랑디와 말은 로미 톱당나는 론드그랑왕 말주랑왕 주드랑왕 가이그랑왕 타나 삼두랑왕 자마요 말이 되는 일동 던인 곳전에 야낙 잠불랑 같당당 다 초대 소소라 지금 보트 시우진 펼지 당자 요지네 잠랑라 접적 점마지네 only in Ransola Tugoni Captilla, or the need of the Mazda Star and it's the Mazi which I need to one and Mumati, or the Dickens in Zamlo Mamala Sachet and Jacob Sozology, the Impunkas at the long end of so good.
The real reason why we made the film Living Fear Behind is because overall Tibetans don't have human rights, Tibetans don't have democracy, including religious freedom, freedom of expression, and so around 2007, the Chinese started propagandizing about how good the situation in Tibet was, how the progress being made in Tibet. And that was all in connection with the upcoming Olympics Games. So we made that film to show the reality of Tibet to the world.
tapon pomang semnang na kariyo na teksa wosi ori da nabatsu ngone na azgyo nara yochiri tena de sarchi chimar goachi tena tan nitong jakalo na wosa yongzogne tan labrang rozam san chesona dawasam bitsi chiksam chichi chongani chala chere te 다 삽시 저거 치모진 보사 용종의 저거 되는 총알이 디나랑 아라니 냠직 지어리 드네 올년데 아티감드네 지니다 갈라고리 드네 다 다왁심비 체인지 셨음거니 마델랑 안전송 당당보디 지어리
That film conveys the true feelings of the Tibetan people about their situation. In 2008, as you know, there was widespread demonstrations all over Tibet. In the hometown, I was then in Labrang, there were demonstrations on March 14 and 15. And I participated in those demonstrations. On March 23rd, I was detained for the first time.
zimnimadela tachi nga tawa tachi ramjing tawa chimazre te bechani da jami kari chi ne zongare jina amagme samja ta nentowa tukche laksamze ke ta tangdi kim soncha peche chine nge che go te gola menda zu ta logik ta jigba ta mambo chi garab dong chine golok labzo sangse zore ta sang zamne nga tini tat rabdong chine nga zamre thongwa zamdi kaptela.
Want to explain a bit about the nature of my detention then. I'm just a simple monk. But so when they came to detain me, they came with 300 soldiers, 60 PSB personnel, and there were machine guns in front of me and behind me. And they also brought electric cattle prods and other measures of coercion.
Teniti kangpa ko nga tani martoni zambu jine go yar kyang ni chikten tedi zamkha de na da me teni wuchin chikchingdu tani ta nga jine zonru thomdi sare oni kapdela manang na yang wuchin ni chikchingdu wuchin ni ge warne nga zamre ti kap ko tongba ga yeng kangpa ti su tangni changma ga tangla memda zone mak chi yang gomba kama ja tendi ki tamchak jine nga zamre.
I had seen the machine guns as I was lifting my head up when I was taken away, and I looked up, and there was one up there in the front, and there was one behind down there. So, and there on all areas there were people with guns pointed at me.
Ngan zamtang de la jikte na ta jami shelok la jik chapchak che oni ramnyam zya zda nga su chi ta chi 톱탕서 konchu 본능 더 열지 당하고 제가 지금 내처 산질 점마 별건데 난 점탕 코나가 탁초 그래 다 가리지 뭐니 본나 볼라 따처 가리지 점 요매 난 점탕 코나가 탁초 거든지래.
So from the very nature of my detention, it's clear how real or how factual the Chinese propaganda is about Tibetans being given equality, Tibetans having rights, or Tibetans having progress.
tene tani nirdong tangjara nga nyentowa ga jamnan rongkhang ra ta chagse wore nyentowa korang so tan ji go tinang tenang cha chong dane ta libo yong zo konji changwa phine libo yong zo ko ser che tene ta rabdong ma ga nyentowa ga rabdong jin cham modela tene ta ti yer za rabdong ji so.
And I was taken to a room nearby where this security personnel was kept. And then I was stripped naked and searched, and then my beatings began the whole night.
근데 때랑 소소 ngaidan ti 다시 난각 때 다시 니르동 땅땅데 놀디 난각 체시도 저땅 가랑라 니르동 땅야데 소로 전에 다시 점모도 샤고야나 티서 징니스 그 차리아를 말해 되나다 다시 티서 땅 떴네 놀디 로지 지네 샤케.
So I want to today just give in a shortened version the nature of suffering that I underwent, because if I had to explain that in detail, it will take a long time.
Tinya jila ti ta jana jami sacha kachi saso da telanga thanne dar dawachi da nimani sakchigrang la nga narche tongare.
And then I was taken to a place called Kachu in that same region, and there I was kept for 1 month, 22 days, during which I continued to experience torture.
티 동땅 나르치 동땅데 가르치 나르치 동땅데 적 급적서 로후된제진도 적 급적데 로후된제야들라다 티 급적디 땅라 적단데 급적단데 사라 고자야 저리 아탄디 그 땅에 급적데라 텐다디다 나르치 땅아래 나르치 땅땅데나 다 적 급적데라 텐네 적 급적라 땅네 탕마 거즈가 남아닥소 tani thangma jalla deni ngana namdakche thangma sigla deni chene namdakche o tani ro chik chene ta thangma tani ngana allo ta ngo sakje ko lo sam jesu jage 다들 뭐록 되니 휴친 보자고 그래 어떤이 로진데 다들 소소데 다들 갑텔라 록 저거 갑자기 땅라 때는 남았다고 저거니 갑라 jabla loik jab tak kari don tak tangana ti chora charang ni lengam de da tari ki narcho chaka kapchak tela tak jane ta libu jane thak jane thanglan rogon wa tanga jamna doni wa lagna zubutana gana thak jete wa te wa tanga jamba na dong du sam sam marto jeme ta tara nama tak jagona tan jerma gi shika ta da ina tamba chu ngoni ta sana yore ka lag jago tangnan jerma damne tin jana ma tak yore tan da so de chaka kapchak tela ten nama tak jere.
During this period, the main tool for torture that they used was what is called the tiger chair. I was shackled on a chair like this, which had shackles both on my feet and my hands. And then I was kept hanging on that chair for 9 times. And there were strong lights that's being shown on me. As a result of all these, my sensations had failed. And although I did know that I was being beaten up at the back through different tools, I couldn't feel that except through seeing the blood coming out from my body.
다 실당가 남딱 지야 당다 동야 당 તને 지 칼라 마스터 파 당 તને 다 지그 아장코르 지그나 다 발레노 તને 총총선들이 샤고 공하노 તને 지그 다 장코르 지그나 라디오레 마라디오레 다 장코르 지그나 꼼체스가 다 니리 니컴도 니리 지라 코 쳐서 작을 때 말도 다 테브레 작거래 작 마락지니 나그 마락지 망냐로 되는 지리 다 때나 디니 나네나 꼼제다 똑지니 난 거다 꼼제다 대체 맞잖아 배 가슈데 텐디들이 다다 잠바죠 망보지 전화데 디소다 더 그 도디로 직신에.
And during that period, in terms of food, if you get one small roll of bread a week, that was very good. In 1 week, if you get a little bit of water, that was also good. So if you think in terms of that, rather than feeling hungry, the feeling of thirst was worse for me.
나르초도 가르치 지니 텐디 나르초 땅 거리잖아. 다 소소데 지로 로년 간나라 주 머서슬라 잔데 제인스. 또 머리리 찌트 제고지. 대찌트 마지나 공수 나르초 땅 거리. 아니어데나 다선비 찌찌 정안이잖아. 라브랑 고미 다 소치비더니 다 가토니 차가니 우랑 제니 갑들라 추쯤나 쪼보세요. 뭐시세요. 다게 sab시저거 나라 직년가 맞대서 찝트 제거스 어떻게 찝트 맞지야 단 나르쳤다 당아래.
Among the many reasons why they tortured me were first that they wanted to know who the people that we interviewed were for that film that we made. They wanted us to reveal those names. Secondly, they wanted me to reveal my accomplices for the demonstrations that I participated in on March 14 and 15 in Labrang Monastery.
다도 네 땅하는 거 대랑한데 지금 가차 나바스 원소네 가차샷 줘야로 당샤다 보바이제 줘야 돼. 가린지나 딱 도중 엄마나 여러분하고 진다네 고르치니 가차까지 전에 소인 다지 속대 소소라 가차 열컵당 지금 만나라 드디 가차잖아. 따티 갑테는 지도 로년은 그 머나리 사브제 저거 나라 지니 그 머나리 딱 나랑 혁성 그 감도 된지다 자송다 네 딘나네 나랑 그 잔데 제사가 맞당 나랑 그 조보 다디 냠식 제와 먹식장 잡니다 된디 나랑라 돈탁당하는 먹식장 찌트지마 딱 나랑 그다 로지 나라 시든지 제나 혁성은 삼네 다른 나랑 그 지금 접지 보바즈가 저거다요.
And today, as I get this opportunity to address you here in the United States, and as I had the opportunity of addressing people in Europe, one thing that I hold myself high is because despite all these tortures that the Chinese inflicted upon me, I haven't given up one name, whether those people involved with the film or with the demonstrations to the Chinese. So I can keep that as my principal stand even unto my death.
근데 다치가 다니 직능가 다치 가차도 카디나 자와랑데 뭐대서 찌트쟁 뭐듯이 가차 란지 여호작 뭐듯이 다치 카드 가차 샤체인사 말이스 다 저랑서 카드 뎁시 제 맨날 다가서 가서 매파 제겐스 뭐 카드 탕막섬람 다 매차르네 매적당서 다디 나즈가 한스와 양 다배 탐모즈레.
So when I didn't reveal any names to the authorities, they said that you do not seem to be giving us anything at all, so your mouth is useless. Therefore, we need to do something about your mouth. So they burned my mouth for thrice, and that was very painful.
단도시 리스턴 나초 동탕을 봐서 다 노르디시 샤인 다 능 샘그 땅라 나초 가르치지니 동거래제나 능 샘그 땅라나 다 점거는 뭐지 참모지 거당 다 오이범이 등직라 좀제지 거 근데 캐나나 조나가 다직 총매에 받아 조니 총매에서 간거 지그제나 켜라지 그냥 요지야로 단디 마치나 초대랑 산네 로 다직 간이나이나 켜랑라 다고메야 어떤이 좀는 싸라는 요 말이 저 아르가 조고 말이 저 여러 드니 조고 말이 냠들 잔속 조고 말이 저 달라막 조고 말이 따티까데나 아르가 선전나 부시리 저랑 좀 싸면 저랑 카브리 잡게 메스 카브리 나가잖아 아주 카브리 잡 다왜 부시 카브리 잡거나 달라막 카브리 잡 저 제가 접다고 말했어 저로 간이나 이 기수서 저 가거든지 다능 샘그 땅에 양다 다 지금 나쳤도야 되는지 그래
In addition to the physical torture that I briefly described, they also inflicted mental torture on me. That included asking me to speak ill of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, asking me to criticize the Central Tibetan administration, asking me to say that I'm a member of the Tibetan Youth Congress, and asking me to reveal the names of the members of the Tibetan Congress. And then they sort of taunted me, saying that there is no one who will save you. The United States will not save you. At that time, President Bush was the president here, and they sort of taunted me by showing me a phone saying, just call President Bush and see if he saves you. Just try calling the Dalai Lama to see if he saves you. So it's like that. They said, you will die like a dog and nobody will care about you.
tatendiji ta shili tangla na chu tang tang na sem ku tangla na chu tang tu ga du shu ti dan shili bu tangla na chu tang te zi zo pan che nga su na ësing ro chai san ro ya tang ri na sem ku tangla na za wa rang ni ta ji na chu te na lag ba ta tendiji ri ta na ta na chu tong tang ga ba te na ta tendiji ke sam chok je yin ta ni da ni tong go lo la na chu tang yo ri ni tong ching ni lo la na chu tang yo ri da ni tong ching ni lo ina dawa gwi nanga zamri dawa gwi nanga ngarang na chi chongkang ni diga chi tan angsan ro chi chere ta tene na khonsu ga kokso chi aro tene chene ta chanshira mayong rang ro cha ta ti korkup te chene tan jami ga tongkang ni na ni go bigu tigare.
Physical torture, although it was bad, was something that I could endure. But the mental torture that was inflicted upon was something that I could not endure. I had physical torture in 2009 and 2012. And at one time, they even wanted to sort of kill me. And upon learning that, I had to escape.
Tan ni tong chini dawa gwi che dari samche thami ni ma rargang la tuni dawa sikda lo sikda dawa dawa ni che thami rang la rargang tuni ta ti la tokom le ta chi kardu ki mangbo zi gen ni tong chi dawa ngawi che chorji ni re che chorji ni ma da jigar dharam sala la ta chanshora yong ari tani nana dawa tangbu na de la ta sara suse chapchara yong ari tani chi ta ne tang ga jeram ro tani chi re.
So in September 30th of 2009, Yidung Gurlo. 2012, I escaped, and for a year and several months, 20 months, I hid in the hills. And eventually, I was able to escape to India in Nidonchonga in 2015. And this year in January, I was given asylum in Switzerland.
Teni jingde ta tuji che jain ta so tuji che gar jig jain jina ni tong dang da ji che jide ni ma de la shonor kon sa cham go jiro on la tun so sel ta ma de pore ti kap de la ngarang pon na yo pon na ni kap de la ngasu lengriang pe shik chimbo ber ta song tena ari tun so la ina tuji che ja ta teni tun so ko theme so na ta lo sar da ji ta ji yang tambe bro ji ne jami mötiso ta ji ponanga ji rangwang da mi ro ma ta ponang ni jong yanang ni sara ji da lepche ba da ne konrik to so yona ja ari jong la yang tang ti yak bu tang ma chok za je tin ri ji tu chon la tu ji ja ba de na ngarang muni na ji sem sam bi tang ni ta ji ar ga ta ji jong dang ta tun so ni cha la ta ma zo pod ma mang ga chap jin ti che je.
And I wanted to end by saying that in 2007, on October 17, when the Congress decided to bestow the Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we people in Tibet felt it. I was in Tibet then, we saw it. And so it was very gratifying. And therefore, as I sit here today to talk to you about it, I also know that the United States cares about access to Tibet for people within Tibet, for domestically, as well as for foreigners wanting to visit Tibet. And therefore, in your 2015 annual report, you mentioned the issue about domestic travel for Tibetans, as well as access for journalists, diplomats, etc. And I wholeheartedly support that. And there are other recommendations that I've made which are in the written statement, so I don't want to talk about them.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jigme, thank you very much for your testimony and for such difficult insights as to what you have suffered. I deeply appreciate the Commission does your testifying today. Yin Li Ping, you're recognized for such time as you may consume.
非常感谢国会中国事务委员会主席邀请我来到这里。
Really appreciate CECC Chairman Mr. Smith to invite me here.
我叫尹丽萍，来自中国辽宁法轮功学员。
My name is Yin Li Ping, a Falun Gong practitioner from Liaoning Province, China.
2013年8月26号，我第3次逃亡成功，成了中国的难民。2015年12月10日，在美国议员和欧洲议员的2年4个月的高度关注和营救下，我成功的抵达了美国。我非常感谢关注我的国家和政府。
I would also like to thank the members of U.S. Congress and the members of the European Parliament for rescuing me to the United States. I arrived on this free land on December 10th, 2015.
在中国，我7次被抓捕，6次被迫害的奄奄一息抬回家，3次被劳动教养，9个月的奴隶般的奴工迫害。我被秘密转押辽宁省6个教养院、地下监管医院和犯人医院，还有张氏劳教所，专门迫害法轮功学员的黑监狱。在那里，我遭到了群体性迫害的同时，还被录了像。
I was arrested 7 times in China, tortured to the verge of death 6 times, and detained in labor camps 3 times, where I was made to do slave labor for 9 months. I was sexually attacked and humiliated and videotaped by a group of male prisoners in police custody, all because I refused to give up my faith in Falun Gong.
这张照片就是马三家教养院的照片，马三家教养院。 我被3次关押在这里边。
This is Ma Sanjia forced labor camp photo, very notorious for persecuting Falun Gong practitioners.
在马三家教养院，在大会上，我听到所长苏静就是在大会上说，对待法轮功，国家就是说对待法轮功，这是一场没有硝烟的战争，动用的国家经费相当于一场国际战争的经费。
I was kept in Ma Sanjia for 3 times. In mid-September 2000, Ma Sanjia, the director, Su Jin, addressed to an assembly of hundreds of jailed Falun Gong practitioners, quote, "This is a war without guns. Our government has spent more money persecuting Falun Gong than fighting an international war," end of quote.
我们马三家教养院。 对法轮功学员的转化率是100%的转化率。然后我听到这句话的时候，我非常的恐惧。他把法轮功当成一场没有硝烟的战争，那个时候我非常的恐惧，听到这句话。
And they also mentioned that, quote unquote, transformation rate must be 100%. The transformation is the word they use for forcing Falun Gong practitioners to give up their belief. When I heard this word, I was so scared.
在马三家这个楼层是4楼，这个4楼里边，我这个位置上就是紧闭室，这个紧闭室里边我就被关到这里。当时是在下肢瘫痪的情况下，我多日绝食的情况下，身体非常虚弱的情况下，把我送到了这个4楼的紧闭，用一种超音倍的声音来迫害我，导致我后来回到家以后。 就是听到任何声音就非常的恐惧。
On the fourth floor of that Malsanja building, it's a solitary confinement, very small area. I was kept there, and they keep broadcasting loud voices for so long that even now when I turn on a TV set, I cannot even turn it on.
这个是马三家的1楼，1楼我在这里被关押过。在2004年的时候，有一位抚顺的法轮功学员，他叫秦清芳，我们2个关押在一起。那个时候我被迫害的奄奄一息的时候，然后那个秦清芳老人跟我说，如果我们2个谁活着出去，就要把这场迫害告诉给世人。后来我活着出去了，他死在了马三甲。
Also on the first floor of another building in Masanja, in 2004, I was kept in one of the rooms, and I met an old lady, Qin Qingfang, from Fushun City. And they talked to each other and promised each one, whoever can survive this torture, and they will come out and tell the world what they suffered. And unfortunately, she heard that old lady, Miss Qin Qingfang, already persecuted to death.
在马三甲，我被就是注射不明的药物2个多月，然后导致我眼睛短暂失明，就是给我拉到医院做抽血啊、心电图啊，还有就是说彩超啊这些什么的，然后多次灌食的时候都是窒息性的那种灌食，差点就是死在马三甲里边。
I was sent to the clinic of Masanja due to my hunger strike. I was cuffed to a bed and injected with unknown drugs for over 2 months. And this caused me to temporarily lose my vision. And I was also put through involuntary ultrasound, electrocardiogram, and blood tests at nearby hospital. As a result, I developed endocrine disorders, incontinence, and had blood in my urine. In addition, their frequent violence, force feeding almost suffocated me.
因为在马三甲，我经历了很多的酷刑的情况下，我没有妥协，后来就是马三甲就把我秘密送到了一个黑监狱，就是上市劳教所的一个黑监狱里边。我在那里边被他们群体性侵。
Since I never been transformed by them, one day I was transported to a very special location. I don't know at the time what that place was.
那是2010年4月19号那一天，我一生都不会忘记这一天。那天早上，我和8名法轮功学员被马三甲秘密转押到这个特殊的地方。然后呢，当我进去的时候，就是进到那个房间里边的时候，里边那个我们9个人被分别单独分到了每个人一个房间里边。
I will never forget the date, April 19th, 2001. That morning, other 8 female Falun Gong practitioners and I were handcuffed by male guards and taken to a police van. The van stopped at the men's labor camp. Later, we learned it was Zhangshi male forced labor camp.
当时我到被关到里边的时候，他在厕所的这个一个边上呢，就是地下就是就是临时搭的那么一个房间里边，地下躺了40多个男人，不是30多个20-30个男人吧，躺在地下。
And then we were lined up in the courtyard. A policeman read an official announcement to us, quote, "If a Falun Gong practitioner is beaten to death, the death will count as a suicide," end of quote. And we were told many times by policemen that this was a direct order from Jiang Zemin, the then head of the Chinese Communist Party. And we were taken to we were taken to 9 different rooms because 9 of us, and I was sent to the first room. There was a large double bed and a floor hanger in the room. 4 men were already in the room waiting. When I went to the public restroom, I saw there was a big room with more than 30 men sleeping there.
当时我非常的害怕，我不知道这里为什么会有这么多的男人，为什么会把我们和男人关押在一起。
I was so frightened and wondered what kind of place this was. Who were those men, and why were there so many men sleeping there?
后来就是我就在走廊里听到了周国勇呼喊我的声音，他就丽萍啊，丽萍，这个政府都在耍流氓了，我们从狼窝又被送到了虎穴。
And then I got the answer that evening. Those men all got up, made a lot of noise, banged on doors, and kept on shouting dirty words. They kicked open my room door and held a hand holder, videotaping me. Then I heard my best friend, Miss Zhou Guirong's voice from the hallway, shouting at around 10 p.m. She kept calling my name, Li Ping, Li Ping. We were sent from a wolf den to a tiger den. This government is a bunch of gangsters.
我听到喊叫我的声音的时候，我就拼命的往出冲，往走廊冲。然后那房间里边的男的拿起那个屋里边的那个落地的那个木的衣架砸我的头，把我。
Yeah, hearing her miserable cries, I rushed into the hallway and met Miss Zhou there. We held each other tightly, no matter how much the men beat us. And one man used that wooden floor hanger in the room and hit on my head. And however, I desperately still wanted to protect her since she was shorter and thinner than me. And the corner of my right eye was swollen from the beating.
然后上来一群男人，就是打我的脸，打我的头，然后把我的衣服全部拽下，我的衣服在脖子这，我的裤子在我的脚面上。其中有一个30多岁的男人骑在我身上，就是打我，一群人过来打我。
And my clothes at the time was torn off, and I was almost naked. And Miss Zhou and I were dragged back to our individual rooms. And 4 or 5 men inmates threw me onto the bed. Some held my arms, some held my legs. One young man, 30-year-old man, sat on me and beat me. I became dizzy and passed out.
我的记忆就停留在这里。
And my memory stopped there.
后来等我醒来的时候，
When I came to conscious,
我身边已经躺了4个男人，3个男人，左边1个，右边2个。我床上还站着2个男人，扛着摄像机给我录像，要被他们群体性侵的，头上有男人，脚下也是男人，一群的男人对我性的侵害的同时，还给我录了像。
when I came to conscious, 3 men were lying beside me, 1 on my left, 2 on my right. There was 1 set on the floor above my head. There were 2 others standing between my legs. 1 videotaping, 1 was watching. There were a few others standing below me. I realized that I had been videotaped, and when I was sexually attacked and humiliated by gangsters of inmates, yeah.
在那一天，我就发誓，我说如果我活着出去，我一定会告你们。如果我要死在这里，我的灵魂绝不会放掉你们。
And I swore to myself, quote, if I ever get out of here alive, I will disclose their crimes and bring them to justice. If I die, my soul will never let them off the hook, end of quote.
Ms. Yin, if we could just take one brief moment, there's, and it'll give you time to collect yourself as well. And I thank you for your willingness to tell us, the commission, and by extension, other members of Congress, what you've been through. We do have 5 votes on the floor. We're almost out of time on the first. We'll take a short recess. Other members I know will be coming back. And again, I thank you for your courage in coming forward. But we will take a very brief recess, and I thank you for your forbearance.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there you go. 告诉你，你真的是很有勇气。So strong. I need to go to the restroom.
on the Constitution, and also chairman of the Religious Freedom Caucus in the House. So it's a delight and a privilege to recognize my good friend and colleague, Commissioner Sean Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think probably most of the people in this room know that Chairman Smith is one of the great human rights advocates in the United States Congress for the past 30 years, and he has the deepest respect on my part, and I know many of yours. And I guess the primary thing that I would say to all of you is that your efforts are not wasted here. Only God knows what fruits will come from your talk here, but you are being responsible and you're letting your compassion, your commitment to humanity prevail here in this forum. And torture is something that those who are perpetrators and those who are observers are shamed by it completely. And the more that you're able to express it in open terms, the more that there are people out there that you will never see that will be spared that tragedy. And so I just want to express the deepest gratitude on my part to all of you, and just the honor that I afford to all of you because of your commitment. And I am convinced that one day, if time turns every star in heaven to ashes, that the eternal moment of deliverance will come to every last one of God's little children. But until then, He has given us the responsibility to do the best we can with the least of these to prevent hurt and tragedy in their lives. And I thank you for exhibiting that commitment today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Franks. I'd like to now re-recognize Ms. Yin to continue your testimony.
在2000，下面我讲一下我被全封闭在疗养教养院做奴工的一段被迫害经历。
The following paragraphs are related to how I was forced labor.
在2000年的1月至9月份，就是我被铁岭教养院给秘密转押到了疗养教养院。
2000, January through September, I was transformed to Liaoyang forced labor camp for 9 months.
在疗养教养院，我被9个月的就是奴工迫害。
Yeah, for those 9 months, I have so much forced labor.
我在那个地方呢，就是白天要干重体力活，就是这个重体力活包括压那个铁条，每4个人一天要压8吨的铁。
In the daytime, I had to load 8 tons of steel bars onto trucks in a team of only 4 people.
当时那个铁条它都是带刺的，然后我的手、我的胳膊当时被铁条划的白花花的，又就是都翻出来，那个血道子一条一条的，新的伤疤还没等好，旧的伤疤就被铁条划的胳膊全是，现在我手上还有疤。
Yeah, on those iron steel bars, there are a lot of thorns, sharp edges, and I always been cut on my 2 arms, bloody, and cannot, recover. Even the old one has not been recovered. Then the new cuts coming up.
我在那晚上还要就是白天干重体力活，晚上还要去扎花。就是那个手工，它是出国的。
And also we need to bound flowers in the evenings until 2 a.m. And those flowers are used for exports.
那个手工活，它是就是扎手的，扎手指的，然后就是拿起来扎，不停的去扎这些花，然后我的手指纹那时候扎的都看不到指纹了，血肉模糊。
And my hands were so badly injured because of those, what they call the flowers, and also had very thorny, that my fingerprints disappear and also bloody.
在那不放弃自己的信仰，然后昼夜不让我睡觉。
And because I still do not want to be quote unquote transformed, and they don't allow me to sleep.
我 我到疗养教养院的时候，我3个月在那3个月就不来例假了。
My menstrual period stopped within 3 months over there,
后来累的就是大量的吐血，
and the vomiting threw up blood,
头发也很快就是白了。
and my hair turned gray.
在那里不让我们见家人，
And do not allow us to meet our family members.
他那所有的奴工产品都是出口到国外的。
And almost all the products we made were exported to overseas.
我迫害的经历很多，我也写下来，就是发到网上。现在我就想，为了节省一点时间，我讲一下这本书。
I have been suffering so much persecution, and I have written that down online. But however, I want to spend a little bit more time about this book.
这本书呢是杜宾先生，他是纽约的前时报记者，然后他是独立制片人。
This book, authored by Mr. Du Bing, he was the former New York Times reporter, and yeah.
这里有杜宾的一句话，我给大家念一下。
There's a sentence from him. I just want to recite it.
献给所有遭受中国劳动教养制度剥削、刑求、凌辱的女人们。
To all those who has been suffered in China, the forced labor system, those who have been persecuted, punished, humiliated women.
一个卑微的男人，唯一能为你们做的，就是呈上这份卑微的敬意和歉意。
A Chinese man like me, the only thing what I can do is to send this my very minor respect and sorry.
这本书里边记录了，就是所有在马三家的幸存者，就是马三家幸存者的证词，这是一本书。
And Mr. Dai Bing collected those survivors' testimony of Masanja forced labor camp, all their tortures, what they suffer from those different torture methods, and particularly sexual abuses and crimes.
这本书里边介绍了非常残酷的迫害，包括性的迫害。
And also, most of those are through Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience.
这位是我家乡的法轮功学员，他叫王玲。
This is my hometown's Falun Gong practitioner. Her name is Wang Ling.
大家可能看到他是没有牙齿，他的
You may-
牙齿一个也没有了。
You may see there she has no teeth in her mouth.
在我逃出国的时候，我去见他，
Before I came outside, escaped from China, I met her.
我就问他，
I asked,
你的牙齿怎么一个都没有了？
what happened to your teeth?
他说他在马三甲的时候，就是被那个男的警察把那个子宫扩张器放到嘴里边。
Because she said, when she was in Masanja labor camp, the jail, the policeman put
把
the
他的
inspection device for female parts into her mouth and expanded to the extreme.
把他的嘴巴撑到最大，然后把他牙齿转掉。
While doing that, her all teeth were crashed.
然后往他的嘴里边塞女人的卫生巾、
And
抹布、
in the
吐痰。
meantime, the police put dirty cloth and even spit in her mouth.
他跟我讲述，在马三甲因为不妥协，给他送到一个不知道什么地方，然后大字型的把他圈在笼子里，然后把他的腿分开，然后用3把牙刷反过来，然后去擦他的下边的私处，去来回的旋转。这是他亲自跟我讲述的他的经历。
And she also said she was put into all limbs stretched to the extreme and put into a cage. And then the policeman used 3 toothbrushes tied together and inserted into and stirred up her private parts. And that's what she told her.
在中国各个劳教所里边，就是没有被曝光出来的，还非常非常的多。
And there are so many other torture methods
现
have
在
not been exposed.
现在迫害还在发生着，然后我想，这个是由于时间的问题，我想讲一下律师。
And the persecution is still going on, even when we are speaking now. And however, because of time limit, she would like to change a little bit to those lawyers who help Falun Gong practitioners in China.
我见证，在这场迫害当中，我见证就是在我们最艰难的时候，高志胜律师他站出来为我们辩护。
As we all talk about Mr. Gao Zhishen lawyer, and he helped a lot of Falun Gong practitioners in China.
在这之后，就是又有王宇律师、王全章律师，还有就是唐吉田律师，他们先后就是在高志胜律师之后，慢慢的了解了这个法轮功，为法轮功学员辩护。
And because Mr. Gao's story being exposed to the world, and also those other other lawyers in China learned from Gao Zhishen's story, so they want to come out to help more Falun Gong practitioners, such as those who she just talked about, lawyer Wang, lawyer Gao, lawyer Tang, and many other lawyers in China.
这法轮功学员在中国呢，就是在最艰难的时候呢，就是不有这些维权律师一点点的走出来为我们辩护，然后我们被迫害的一些信息呢，不断的就是曝光给世界，然后我在这。
Okay, just because of those more other human rights lawyers are willing to come out to help Falun Gong practitioners in China. And now a lot of Falun Gong practitioners need their help, and they form like a news information group. They communicate with each other.
表面上呢，就是我们法轮功学员被迫害的一些压力由于这些正义律师的出现呢，就是减缓了一些。
And because of those lawyers' help, the pressure from the Chinese government on the Falun Gong practitioner is a little bit not so much being helped.
没有想到，就是在2015年7月9日这一天。
Unfortunately, on July 9th, 2015.
那天早上我也是终生都不会忘记。
I will never forget about this day.
我的电报信息里传来了，就是王宇律师被抓捕。
I learned that lawyer Wang Yu was arrested that morning.
然后就是把我就是这些律师们在国内就是临时的建了一个营救王宇律师的这么一个群。
And then we quickly had this internet group set up to rescue him.
我有幸就是在那个群里边。
Luckily, I was in that group.
当时这些律师们呢，他们就想怎么想办法去营救王宇律师。
There are a lot of other lawyers trying to help, trying to think about how to rescue Wang Yu, lawyer Wang Yu.
没想到到了晚上的时候，
Unfortunately, in the evening,
全国各个城市就出现了大量的抓捕律师的事件。
news from around the whole China, in each city, large scale of arrests of lawyers happened.
那一夜我们都震惊了，我没有睡觉，我一直的在关注全国抓捕律师事件。
And that evening, I couldn't sleep. I was taking very close attention to about what's going on.
我是7月6号那天向中国递交了起诉江泽民的诉状。
Actually, on July 6th, I already submit my suing paper document to the legal system in China to sue Jiang Zemin.
那时候我就在想，然后我们法轮功学员在大量的在全国范围之内，就是 起诉江泽民，然后他们在7月9号这一天，就是全国范围内的抓捕律师。
And I thought, because in that period, a lot of Falun Gong practitioners are suing Jiang Zemin legally in China, and then within a couple of days, then they have a large-scale arrest of those lawyers.
我2天2夜没有睡觉，在关注律师被抓捕事件。
So I didn't sleep for 2 nights.
这个，当时我就是更为法轮功学员或者那些人权被迫害的这些弱势群体而担忧。
So I really worry about Falun Gong practitioners, but not only Falun Gong practitioners, but also other persecuted groups in China.
Ms. Yin, I've got 2 minutes to get to the floor for a recorded vote. It's an important vote. I will be back right after that, but Senator Cotton and some other senators, we believe, are on their way as well. So please hold that thought. We stand in brief recess, and I apologize again.
不是，我最后要讲一下啊。
louder.
这位是法轮功学员王杰，
This is a photo of Wang Jie, also a Falun Gong practitioner.
他在2002年的2000年的10月8号这一天哈，就是对2002年10月8日这一天被抓捕，为什么呢？
She was arrested on October 8th, 2002.
他在收集整理，就是在辽宁省迫害法轮功学员的证据的过程当中被抓捕，被判刑了7年。
The reason she was arrested because she was at the time of collecting evidence of the persecution of Falun Gong, and then she was sentenced to 7 years in jail.
他在监狱里，马三家监狱里服刑了7年以后，然后回到家里不到1年的时间，我就听到了他的消息。听到他的消息的时候，他已经在沈阳医大医院抢救室里边了。
After 7 years, and just when she was released, within a year, she passed away because of her bladder cancer.
我就坐在这个椅子旁，陪了他短短人生当中的最后10天。
I was just sitting next to her while she was in the hospital.
他在弥留之际那一天，正好是他女儿的生日，就是2012年的4月20号那天。
2012, April 21st. The day before her daughter's birthday, she was already very weak.
那天他的姐姐说：“王杰，王杰。”
Her sister kept calling her and saying, Wang Jie, please don't die.
你可千万不要这天走啊！这天是你女儿的生日啊！
Please don't die this day. It is your daughter's birthday.
你让她以后可怎么过？
How can she live on if you die now?
不知道是她的坚持，还是说天意，还是说是奇迹？她在第2天的早晨9点15分死在了我的怀里。
And I don't know if it was heaven's will or hers will. And she died around 9 a.m. the next morning in my arms.
我和王杰、周桂荣，我们3个经历了最残酷的迫害，在我们
And also the other lady, Wang Jie, Zhou Guirong, 3 of us went through all those persecution.
我们3个互相有约定，
We promised one another,
如果我们3个谁能活着出来，要讲述这场迫害， 让全世界的人都知道。
if any one of us can survive this persecution, we have to come out and tell the whole world, expose those persecution.
我今天91生的活着走到了这里，我带着他们来到了这里，讲述了我们被迫害的。
Today, I take both of them with me to here to tell the people about what happened.
这位是我们沈阳的法轮功学员，
And this is another practitioner from Shenyang.
他叫高蓉
Her
蓉，
name is Gao Rongrong.
他被杀人灭口，
She was killed because she was also a Falun Gong
他再
practitioner.
也讲述不了他被迫害的经历。
She cannot tell her story anymore.
谢谢大家，我今天带他们来到这里，谢
I-
谢大家。
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to tell the stories. I took them all with me today.
Jean, thank you very much again for sharing this with the commission. We are joined by Tim Waltz. Thank you, Tim, for being here. Okay, we'll go to Dr. Richardson then. Such time as you would like to use.
Thanks. I think in the interest of welcoming your questions, which I think everybody would like to answer, I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version. I do want to say, Chairman Smith, members of the Commission, thank you so much for your devoted leadership on these issues over the years. We're also extremely grateful for your world-class staff, who are excellent colleagues. I would like very much to associate HRW with Professor Lewis's remarks and to thank Golok Jigme and Yin Li Ping for their courage and sharing their stories. I think the facts of the matter are established. There's only one aspect of this issue, of the issue of torture, that we covered in our May 2015 report that we haven't talked about this afternoon. I want to take a moment to underscore that, to give you a little bit of math or metrics, and that in researching this report, we looked at a 4-month slice of cases that were available through the Supreme People's Courts database. We looked at 158,000 court verdicts looking for indications that suspects in criminal detention had alleged torture or ill treatment in detention. We found from that universe only about 432 cases, which we think is very much a function of the difficulty that criminal suspects face in detention centers getting claims of ill treatment lodged with the authorities. Of those 432 cases, only 23 resulted in the court throwing out evidence, but not a single one resulted in an acquittal. And we only found one prosecution involving 3 police officers responsible for torture. None of them served jail time, not a one. Quite simply, police torture and ill treatment of suspects in pretrial detention remains a serious problem, largely because the measures taken that were described by Professor Lewis are ignored in practice. They're great on paper. They are not serving suspects in reality. We had hoped in doing this research that many of the recommendations that we had made could be seized upon by the Chinese government in advance of its November 2015 review under the Convention Against Torture, which was taking place about 6 months after this report came out. They could have worked to hold police accountable. They could have significantly reduced the amount of time a suspect can be held in police custody before seeing a judge. They could have moved to ensure that lawyers are present during police interrogations. They could have adopted legislation guaranteeing suspects' right to remain silent. They did none of those things. In our view, the United Nations Convention Against Torture review of China was critically important, especially at a time when torture survivors, lawyers, and other activists have so much difficulty accessing any forms of redress inside the country. The list of issues which sketched out the committee's concerns was unbelievably detailed and diverse. The actual interactive dialogue was quite extraordinary in that the members of the committee did not shy away from asking any of the difficult questions, not a one. Unfortunately, they weren't given the benefit of proper replies. Requests for data went unanswered. Direct questions were responded to with misleading or patently untrue replies. Arguably, the rock bottom moment was when the Chinese delegation leader suggested that tiger chairs, which people have spoken about and is depicted in the photograph on the cover of this report, were in fact used for suspects' quote, comfort and quote, safety. We find that a little bit hard to believe. You could not ask for a better roadmap to mitigating or hopefully eradicating torture in China than this document, the committee's concluding observations. This is what China needs to do to fix the problem. Whether you're talking about Tiananmen survivors or their family members, whether you're talking about North Koreans, Falun Gong practitioners, whether you're talking about criminal procedure reform, it is all there. It raises issues that are foundational. The very definition of torture. China signed onto this convention in 1988. Its legal definition of torture still does not match what the convention requires. It challenges on procedural issues that they still haven't replied to queries from their last review in 2008. And it addressed a number of the very significant needs for reforms in areas that we've talked about this afternoon. Whether China takes those, of course, remains to be seen. Most of our recommendations were, of course, geared towards the Chinese government, but as always, we think there are steps that the US government and that the Congress can take. I think the first area of focus ought to be whether the US is using all, and I mean all, interactions to press Chinese counterparts on mitigation of torture. And by that, I mean everything from the Minister of Public Security, Guo Shangquan's meetings with National Security Advisor Susan Rice. I mean working level interactions about China's hunt for fugitives or securing nuclear materials. I mean in training programs for Chinese police here in the US, in the sensitive issues session of the SNED, or in the run-up to the G20 in Hangzhou in September. I think US officials have to make clear and set benchmarks that significant progress towards mitigating torture is an essential precursor to more substantial bilateral law enforcement and other kinds of cooperation.
Could you yield on that? When you talk about all, has the president, has Susan Rice, and has the Secret Service, for example, leading up to the G20, done that?
It's a fine question.
Oh, okay, we don't know.
It's a fine question. It's that and several other aspects of this debate are unclear to me. And one of the recommendations I want to make is that it's harder, I think, than it ought to be to get clarity about the precise nature, particularly of law enforcement and any other kind of security force cooperation between the two. And it's amazing how infrequently you hear the term Leahy vetting invoked in accordance with China. I think there should be a review of what exactly this cooperation entails and what opportunities might be missed. So that's one area I think that's important to look at. The other is really in supporting UN mechanisms. And again, I want to stress, we've talked a little bit about the ways in which Chinese activists or activists from the mainland have been restricted in accessing these kinds of reviews in Geneva. They've been harassed, they've been prevented from traveling. We all know the case of Cao Shanli, who died for her efforts trying to participate in the UPR. These mechanisms matter enormously for China. It's all people have these days. Obviously, they can't take their cases to court. So in this sense, what I'd like to ask you to do is to push China to issue invitations to the special rapporteurs on all of these issues: torture, lawyers, enforced disappearances. Speaking out as you have, and we know you will continue to do, when access to mechanisms for independent activists from the mainland is denied or restricted. We would ask that, whenever you are speaking with the Chinese ambassador to the US or other officials, you ask why their government is unwilling to provide credible answers in these review processes. The more you reiterate those questions, the harder it is for them to avoid them. The third area there's a lot of room, I think, for improvement is in providing support to survivors of torture in the mainland. There are one aspect we had not been aware of was just how few services there are available to people, whether it is physical rehabilitation, whether it's psychological counseling. The ironies of one of the best known cases of somebody who's been repeatedly tortured and essentially prosecuted for trying to get some redress for having been tortured was stopped on his way to Hong Kong, which was the only place in the region where he could find a counselor who could work with him on PTSD. There are almost no services available to people. So I think this ranges from adding the names of torture survivors, like the people who have shared their stories with us today, or people like Nian Bin, whose case we've written about, to your list of cases of concern. You could engage groups like the American Medical Association or the American Psychiatric Association or any USG-funded medical or psychiatric exchanges to see if there's room in their work to actually provide support to survivors. I'm glad Mr. Waltz is here because some of the US's best experts in this realm on assistance to torture survivors are in Minneapolis, they're in LA, they're in New York. I think those are resources that we should tap. The US could underwrite training specifically for people to provide these services. And then last but not least, I think there is merit in easing the way to the US or other countries for torture survivors so that they can at least get out and have their stories heard. I'll just close by noting that I swapped emails last night with someone in the mainland who helped us with our research. And she closed her message with the hope that someday such discussions would not only take place in Washington and Geneva, but also in Beijing. And in the meantime, we, and I'm sure many others, thank you for having this hearing.
Dr. Richardson, thank you so very much. You know, on the torture victims, I actually authored the Torture Victims Relief Act 4 times, and we have a pending bill that would reauthorize it. We need to ensure that people, the walking wounded, if you will, and one estimate puts it as many as 500,000 people who are in America, usually asylum, people who have been granted asylum, carry PTSD or some form of it. So I'd like to coordinate with you to see how we could further ensure that the suffering Chinese diaspora avail themselves of those services, because again, a good psychiatrist, psychologist, a good program may not eliminate the nightmares and the pain, but it could mitigate it. So, and that has been the story of the Torture Victims Center. So I thank you for bringing that up. Let me ask, I'll only ask one question, yield to my colleagues, then I'll have a few if time does permit. The first would be on the, maybe Professor, you might want to take this or others. The whole idea of providing video and audio recording of interrogations and, quote, interviews is often gamed, is often a fraud as it unfolds. I'll never forget, I've been in camps, prison camps in Russia, Indonesia, China, Northern Ireland, and many other places. And I'll never forget being in Long Kesh in Northern Ireland when the British were showing me how, Long Kesh had a terrible reputation for beating people and coercing the coughing up of names and information and confessions. So they put in these cameras, and while I was there on the Potemkin village tour, talking to the police at the time, they said, oh, here in the next room is the monitor, and it's all being surveilled and watched. And I said, what's this button here? Oh, that's the off button. I said, well, what happens in terms of the video if that's hit while somebody's being beaten? Nothing. The person who actually does the auditing is his fellow officer. So there's there's a potential conflict of interest that is huge. And I'm wondering in China where, they get kudos from the international community for at least installing some of this. When it comes to actual application, it seems to me it's a, it just invites fraud.
Right.
And I saw it myself at a Northern Ireland prison.
So at least some of the video recording equipment is the kind now where if someone enters the room, it turns on. And that's what was emphasized to me by legal experts. But of course, there's this problem of who is auditing the process. You can say the machinery is such that you enter the room, it turns on, but if the whole process is in the hands of the procuratorate, the prosecutors, and the police, then how do we know that? And this was raised in the report by the Committee Against Torture. And of course, too, it only works if you're in a location where there is the videotaping recording. So if you are at one of these residential surveillance at a designated place, not necessarily the person's home, if you're at a black jail, if you're at an extrajudicial site, wherever that might be, you're just not going to have any recording. So it's only as good as feeling confident that this is a true recording. Beyond that, even if you do get a recording, you need to have a defense lawyer who can use this in court. And then the final link, which is lacking, is a judge who is willing to stand up to the prosecutor and the police and say, did you actually, what happened in this room? And you do not see judges in a position right now that they will question the police. Police do not show up as witnesses. So that crucial final link to actually implement an exclusionary rule is lacking.
If I could just add one quick point to that, in a way, it's even a little bit worse. I mean, we had interviewees tell us that they were being held in formal detention centers with all of the proper proceedings, and they were simply taken out of the detention centers and beaten up and then brought back, right? So you can equip the facilities until the cows come home, but if there is no accountability for the police for behaving that way, it's not going to matter much.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. First of all, thank you all for being here and sharing painful stories. It's important. The one thing we always ask, and I returned in November from Tibet, is to ask people as they courageously approached us, does it hurt when we talk about these things? Does it hurt your cause? Does it make it worse? And they universally say no. Continue to bring it to light. And so I appreciate that. And Dr. Richardson, I appreciate you pointing out the Center for Victims of Torture and their rehabilitation programs. I would just say, and it seems absurd to me that we would have to state this, but in today's world, we may. This nation rejects torture in all forms, no matter what any private individual may express. We have got to stand as strong as we ever have, because listening to the stories here, and this commission and those commissioners that sat on it, I know share that. and make that case as strongly as we can, because the moral authority we hold matters, and the actions we take matters. So I say that because I think it's important for people to know, and probably more so for me to say that, because I never would have imagined in my life I, as a United States Congressman, would be defending the United States position that torture is unacceptable in all forms in any situation. So to clear that out, and I don't, maybe Dr. Richardson or Lewis, maybe you could help me with this, because I had an opportunity to have a supper with the Chinese ambassador here, and what was interesting to me is the first time I ever witnessed this, we had a frank and candid conversation about Tibet in a way that was very un-Chinese, if you will, not evasive, not let's change the subject, let's have that conversation. Is that misplaced optimism on my part to think that perhaps this conversation at higher levels is actually being taken seriously, to understand that long-term rule of law is going to be dependent on getting this right? And I know it's a subjective question, but your expertise would be appreciated.
Maybe I can take a stab at that, and then there are plenty of other people on the panel qualified. I'll get optimistic when we see that there are no more political prisoners in Tibet. I'll be optimistic when people have the freedom of movement. I'll be optimistic when people can challenge in court the way they have had their religious practices restricted. I'm sure Ambassador Cui is plenty good at saying the right thing in the right moment. That's
How
why he's
much
got
do you
the job
believe he
has.
knows? How much do you believe he knows of what's happening?
Oh, I think he probably knows a fair amount. I think he's equally knowledgeable.
So the
about
old fallback that it's a few
what
bad
to say
apples.
in the right moment.
Yeah, so that doesn't work. You don't buy that at all.
No.
It's a few bad officials at lower levels, and that happens everywhere type of attitude.
Well, I think it logically follows that if you think you've got bad apples, you fire them, or you prosecute them, or you hold them accountable. You don't then turn around.
And there is no
simply
mechanism
ignore it.
that really works to do that.
I'm waiting to see it.
Yeah.
I mean, look, the mechanisms exist, right? I mean, China has a legal system. It's just not used.
Because
to hold
candidly, to
people
you, over 20, nearly 30 years of visiting, and certainly subjective from my position, it felt worse to me than it ever has. It felt worse to me in the oppression, both from Christians in Hong Kong to Uyghurs to Tibet. And so that troubles me that it's heading in the wrong direction.
It's a really tough time, and I am an optimist, but a long-term optimist. I think that under the current leadership, we are going to see very little good news when it comes to human rights, and that's really unfortunate. But I don't want that to be a reason for disengagement. As you said, that it matters that our voice is out there, and I really sincerely believe there are wonderful people inside the government whose heart is in the right place and outside the government. And when I go over, not during the official dialogues, but during the tea breaks or over lunch, I see that they are concerned too about the future of their country, and they believe in the rule of law. And right now, they're concerned not just about themselves, but their families, because this isn't just about, if I stick my neck out, I might lose my job, I might end up in prison. I have kids that I need to make sure they're going to be okay. I understand why people are hesitant to speak out sometimes, but we need to cultivate those relationships and hope that, not tomorrow, but longer term, this will turn in the right direction.
Something that was interesting in this dialogue with high-level officials up to Premier Lee was when I would speak about this a little bit on this trip with them in Beijing in November, they would always mention, they say, oh, I see, Congressman, you used to live on Pine Ridge. How did that work for you? And I thought it was so interesting. They were trying to make it, you've done it too. You have no moral authority, and that's why I bring this up earlier, that I think we have to guard against that, because it was an argument I had never seen them make before, that you've done it and we're on the equal status, and yes, we have too.
And I just want to add with that when I go to China and they say, well, what about Guantanamo, or what about the transgressions, that I point out at Seton Hall, we have a center at the law school that published the Guantanamo reports, a highly critical report of the U.S. government using the Freedom of Information Act to get information. Everyone who worked on that report went home to their families. No one lost a job. No one went to prison. In fact, they were celebrated as bringing to light problems that our government needed to face. And that is a fundamental difference between our two governments.
Yes, absolutely, and that's when we're our best. So anyone else on just general feelings of direction?
我先补充一下，
I would like to add something.
我 我透过翻译听到一些事
Through
情。
the interpreter, I heard something.
我想，从我的角度来讲，
From my point of view,
我想，迫害就是在这场没有硝烟的战争的这场迫害当中，这些迫害者应该受到惩罚。
those who they claim this is a war without guns against Falun Gong in China, and she believes those who made her suffer so much pain should be punished.
当时，我就只问抓捕我、迫害我的警察们，我问他们：你们为什么这么残酷的迫害我们？
And at the time, she asked those police who persecuted her, "Why you are doing this to me so cruelly?"
有一些警察他就直接跟我说：他说我们也不愿意迫害你们，是因为
Some police even told her, "I don't even want to do this, but
江泽民有令，对你们名誉搞臭、经济搞垮，名誉搞臭、经济搞垮、肉体消灭，打死白打死，打死算自杀，这是江泽民的命令。
this is from the top, very top Jiang Zemin, his order that he wants to make defend all of you and make all your property gone, and also kill you, will treat you as a commit suicide, even you got killed.
我的理解是，江泽民利用了国家，然后呢，挑起了这场没有硝烟的战争。
And he was the top one who initiated this persecution in the beginning.
导致我们家破人亡、妻离子散、流离失所、学生辍学。
So there are so many people like myself lost my family. A lot of other students cannot go to school, and also property loss. Many other bad things.
所以我要求，就是我的愿望是，他们就是在这场没有硝烟的战争当中，他要负起他的责任。
So I really wish that those who are responsible for this war without guns be punished.
要承受这个结果后果。
They have to take the responsibility of this outcome.
我手里整理了，就是不全面，就是能有1/3的吧，参与迫害我的这些法轮功的，参与迫害我的这些责任人和警察，我希望他们对所有这场迫害的这些人们，他要负起这个责任来。
Now I'm holding a list of 41 people I can still remember, those who persecuted me,
这里有江泽民、
and
薄
also
熙来、
including Jiang Zemin and Bo Xilai.
王立军，因为
王立军
薄熙来和王立军当时就是在我那个辽宁省，我被迫害的时候，他在辽宁省任职。
Because Bo Xilai and Wang Lijun at the time, they were in Liaoning province in charge of everything.
这个是文世镇，当时
The first one is Wen Shizhen.
当时他是辽宁省的省委书记。
He at the time was the provincial secretary, party secretary.
在马三家第3次兑现大会的时候，
On one of the meeting in Masanja, the assembly of all the Falun Gong practitioners,
他亲眼目睹了法轮功学员在大会上揭露说马三家有迫害，然后一群警察把这个走沟荣拽走，然后很多录像机都录到了这一幕，他见证了法轮功被迫害的这个状况。
he saw at the time some Falun Gong practitioners said they have been tortured by the police in Masanja. And then right away, a lot of police start beating those practitioners. And he saw right over there.
就在那一天，他把辽宁省马三家教养院的牌子
And then on the same day, he changed the title of Masanja labor camp
换成了马三家思想教育学校。
to the Masanja Mind Re-Education Center.
那个牌子上有他的亲笔题词，
And that label, that plaque has his own signature.
还有这些马三家，就是这些迫害我们的警察，到现在目前为止，他们没有一个受到法律的惩罚和制裁。
And those who persecuted Ms. Yin at the time in Masanja, they are still working in Masanja doing the same thing, persecuting other practitioners now
他们还在迫害其他人。
and all other people.
这个就是我先前讲的马三家所长苏静。
And this is what she mentioned in her testimony, Ms. Su Jin.
就是他在大会上说，对你们法轮功学员是一场没有硝烟的战争，国家动用的经费相当于一场国际战争。
Yeah, she said about this war is a war without gun, and the money spent on this persecution of Falun Gong is like an international war.
就是我今天正式的在这个场合向美国国务院递交这份就是迫害我的警察们。
I would like to officially submit this
让他
to
们
the
对
U.S.
他们的
Congress.
行为负责。
Hopefully, the U.S. Congress can help to punish those people who are responsible for this.
Thank you. Commissioner Hochert?
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for telling your story. It is so important, and appreciate your courage and coming before us, and for us finding ways that we can help. But just very grateful for what you're doing. I do have a couple questions, if I could. Ms. Yin, if I could address a question to you. We've heard stories and claims that China has abolished the re-education through the RTL system back in 2014. I wonder, to your knowledge, is the facility at Masanjia still in operation today? Is it still used to detain Falun Gong practitioners? And do you know if Falun Gong practitioners currently detained there suffer the same kind of torture and abuse that you did?
是的，我先生的姐姐，她叫刘庆芳。
Yes,
That-
my husband's sister or my sister-in-law, Liu Qinfang.
她在2014年，她在2014年的4月10号这一天被她清河区的这个法院给判刑3年，然后给
2014,
4月10号，
April 10th, she was sentenced
对，3年马三家。
3 years to Masanjia.
对，在半个月之前，我们家乡的法轮功学员李宗渊因为起诉江泽民，他被判了7年半。
And about 15 days ago, 2016, March 28th, Mr. Li Zhongyuan, also a Falun Gong practitioner, at the time he was, as she also mentioned earlier, suing Jiang Zemin in China. Then he was arrested and sentenced to 7 years in prison.
我还知道很多马三家就是我认识的法轮功学员在马三家就是监狱被迫害的事情，但是由于安全问题，在这里边，因为他们还在大陆，我不方便再提他们的名字。
And as a matter of fact, she knew many other practitioners are still being persecuted in mainland China because of, for their safety, she doesn't want to disclose their names.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, if I could ask you a couple questions. The UN experts panel noted in their concluding observations that there were 7 human rights defenders who were prevented from participating in the Convention Against Torture review. I wonder if you'd be able to provide an update on the status of those 7 individuals, and are they still unable to leave the country? Have they faced any further consequences since the conclusion of the CAT review?
It's a little bit of a difficult question to answer because not all of those people chose to identify themselves publicly. I think it is a reasonable assumption that they have not been allowed to leave the country, especially if you sort of look at the general trends that Professor Lewis was alluding to earlier. I mean, this has been a terrible period for civil society, and we've seen either people prevented from leaving or grabbed back from other places. We know that of the 2 who did publicly identify themselves have been harassed, partly in response to their interest in participating in the review. The other 5, I think we can only make reasonable assumptions about for now.
Dr. Richardson, also the concluding observation, noted that China told the committee, and I quote, government acts of intimidation and reprisals against citizens do not exist in China. Of course, from your work at Human Rights Watch and just from our involvement reading the paper, other things, we just know that's absolutely false. Some statements like this from the Chinese government suggest that they're not participating in international human rights mechanisms in good faith. Would you agree with this, first of all? And then if so, why is China participating in this review process at all? And what can be done either, and I think you talked about some of this, but just I guess to reiterate, what we can do either United States unilaterally or through our involvement in international institutions to make these mechanisms more meaningful and productive and hold their feet to the fire?
I mean, it's a huge question. I'll try to answer it in 60 seconds or less. I mean, look, that statement on the delegation's part was just ludicrous.
Yeah.
It did not pass the laugh test, not even close. And we can document lots of cases to show that. Why do they participate at all? Because they can participate in bad faith and there aren't really lousy consequences. And you know, this is the nature of the way the covenants are written and they're implemented. It's not that the UN is failing. I don't have enough positive things to say about how the committee itself approached and carried out the review. It was exemplary. It's that there aren't consequences for participating badly, which is where other governments that care about human rights issues in China come in. You know, and it is to say to the Minister of Public Security, I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to host you for X and such meeting unless you have answered some of these key questions or released some of these people from prison. Or, you know, there has to be a consequence attached to it.
Has that happened at all or no?
I think there's a tiny little bit of it. I think to the extent it happens, it is, look, if it's hard for me to see, and if it's hard for you to see,
Right.
it's invisible to most of the people who
Right.
desperately need to see it and who need to be seen to be treated that way, right? I mean, it has to be visible that there is some negative consequence for standing at the top of the torture apparatus and failing to follow your own laws. You know, and that's where I think a scrub of issues like law enforcement cooperation come in, to be able to more precisely identify the people who should be responsible, you know, without ruling out precisely the kinds of people Professor Lewis has spoken about who are essential long-term to solving the problem, right? I think people behave differently when they know there's a rotten consequence coming at them for not changing their ways. And that's what I think energy has to go into creating those disincentives.
Yeah. We obviously need to do a better job as a government here of being strong there. What other international allies or institutions do you think would maybe join with us? Because I think there is some power in numbers and maybe different avenues of attack there. Where would you recommend, I guess, that we have our best chance or best groups internationally be working with, governments or institutions?
Right. I'm going to answer that in two different ways. First of all, the U.S. gets a lot of credit for spearheading an unprecedented joint statement at the Human Rights Council in March. That had not happened since 2004, during the previous commission. 11 other governments joined on. That's a practice that should be continued. It matters. It really registered in Beijing. There were also a couple of joint letters. So it's our view that more of these efforts that can be done jointly with other like-minded governments and with some unusual suspects are effective. It really gets Beijing's attention. The other way to think about it is to think about the kinds of engagements that Beijing cares about the most, right? The high profile, the glossy, the glitzy. You know, let's look at, you know, there's supposed to be a real vigorous independent civil society component to the G20. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that ain't going to be happening in China this summer in advance of September. I think what we'll probably see is a very government-run, NGO-driven process to sort of check the box. But it's not going to be the kind of discussion that involves independent activists. You know, I think there's real merit in dialing down the pomp and the glitz. I have to say, the 5 hours I spent at the state dinner in September were trying. I have respect for people whose job it is to try to talk all day to Politburo members who really don't want to talk back. But that was an occasion that the Chinese cared enormously about. And you know what? I don't think a whole lot of very important U.S.-China business necessarily got transacted that night. and it could have been handled very differently in a way that would have hurt for the right reasons.
I would just add that I think when we raise these issues with China, we need to come with specifics, with the facts, that if we just speak in terms of rule of law is important, human rights are important, that not only is easy for China then to come back with platitudes, but it also makes them think that we don't know what we're talking about. And one point that when I was at the Legal Experts Dialogue in October, I really commend the State Department for showing up with facts. And they said, well, what about this person? And what about this instance? And then it forces the Chinese to be more specific and also to recognize that we're doing our homework. So if we're going to raise these issues, we need to raise them not just as abstract concepts, but bringing in the specific cases and the specific steps that need to happen in order to show progress.
That's good. That's helpful. Thank you all so much. I yield back.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let me just conclude with a few final questions, and thank you again for your expertise and for coming forward and helping this commission do a better job. Let me first begin with the idea of consequences. I've been a critic of this administration, and I will continue to be so. I would love to praise it instead, but there have been numerous times where a strong rhetorical expression on the part of the president on down could have and would have made a difference. Certainly, when Hu Jintao was here and was asked a pointed question about human rights in the press conference, and the president defended the status quo by saying, well, they have a different culture and a different political system. The Washington Post very properly wrote a scathing editorial that said, the headline was, Obama defends President Hu Jintao, on rights, because it gave him a pass. And that's all they're looking for, in my opinion. If they can get out unscathed or relatively unscathed, no harm done, they live to abuse and abuse another day. State dinners and the like ought to be predicated on real progress. Li Xiaobo ought to be released immediately. It is unconscionable that a Nobel Peace Prize winner remains incarcerated and his wife all but incarcerated under house arrest and not doing very well, continues to serve out a jail sentence for asking for reform and doing it in a totally nonviolent way. Consequences, I've asked the administration repeatedly to enforce the visa ban that I wrote in the year 2000 on the horrific forced abortion and involuntary sterilization program that has led to disproportionality on males to females, the likes of which we've never seen. Girls targeted, the girl child, simply because she's a girl and is killed through sex selection abortion, has now exacerbated the trafficking issue. It's a gender crime with few parallels, and yet there's no visas being denied, which is the law. Just enforce the law. And I will ask again that the administration do this. We had to ask the Congressional Research Service to give us an accounting. And you can count on two hands how many people have been denied visas, even though women have been so horrifically mistreated. On trafficking, I just chaired a hearing. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, so I follow that issue every single day. China was one among 14 countries that got a passing grade, in other words, not Tier 3, egregious violator, and it allows them to not be sanctioned for sex and labor trafficking, which is exponentially increasing because of the missing girls and because of a great deal of buying and selling, turning women into commodities in China. They should have been Tier 3 and sanctioned. That would have sent a clear, unmistakable record to them, or message. On religious freedom, we have a tool sitting right there for all these years. Frank Wolf wrote the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. China has been a CPC country ever since. They torture religious believers. They torture Falun Gong practitioners. They're CPC. Where's the sanctions? His bill prescribed 18 specific mutually reinforcing sanctions that could be imposed on China. And some of them have real, heavy, serious consequences economically as well as other ways. And I look, you know, where's the sanctions regime? For half of President Obama's term in office, he didn't even designate CPCs, and they had no ambassador at large You know, and now we have a very fine rabbi who runs it, but there was no enforcement of religious freedom. Another big issue. And Xi Jinping, from my trip there with these two gentlemen in Shanghai, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that Xi Jinping is on a tear to do what he calls sinification of the churches, the practitioners, and everyone else who have a faith or have any kind of religious expression to further tighten the screws on the free exercise of anything that even comes close. Next week, the Foreign Affairs Committee will mark up the Magnitsky Act, make it global. It'll probably pass the House with flying colors, be signed into law. And we'll have another tool that I fear will go unutilized vis-a-vis China to hold all of these people, the ones that Ms. Yen just described, and the more in the weeds that we get in terms of people who commit torture, we can deny them visas now, but now we'll have even a more moral imperative to do so and legislative sanctioning of that with the Magnitsky Act, which has been applied, as we all know, to Russia. It'll apply to the world, and that is coming. We haven't had the rhetoric, in my opinion. Yes, we've had some very good State Department lawyers who know their business, who raise these issues with their interlocutors. But when it gets to the higher levels, there's a great big void, and it is time. At the UN, we do raise these issues, but again, as you pointed out, Dr. Richardson, there's very little by way of enforcement. And I know that, you know, just let me, before yielding to Gulang Jigme, when you talked about earlier the issue of cattle prods, on April 3rd, 1995, I convened a hearing of my Human Rights Subcommittee. We had 6 survivors of the Laogai. Catherine Ho, who had been abused while she was held by the Chinese. But we also had Paulden Gyatso, who, when he came, he literally brought the cattle prod that was used, one that he bought since, and to demonstrate how it is used against prisoners, in this case, Tibetan nuns and monks. And he held it to different parts of his body and explained what the pain is like when this cattle prod is being applied to the genitals, under the arms, and in other sensitive areas. When he came into the Rayburn House Office building, our police stopped him from coming in because he was carrying something that looked very nefarious, which it is. And I had to go down and escort him in. But you could have heard a pin drop as he talked about torture that he had experienced personally, like you. And I know you wanted to elaborate on, I think, a question that was raised by Mr. Waltz. But this issue of torture is so heinous. Doesn't Xi Jinping realize the dishonor it brings to his government? Because these torturers are government employees and obviously owe their employment to his regime. It brings a loss of face and a dishonoring to the regime. And you can't tell me he doesn't know. You know, remember when that was used during the Third Reich, when people said, if only the Fuhrer knew. Well, Xi Jinping, if he doesn't know, should know now, but I do believe he knows, and he should take corrective action, as should his government, against these people who commit acts of perversion, sexual abuse, rape against innocent people. So please, if you could respond and also perhaps answer one of the earlier questions that I believe you wanted to answer.
네, 저는 그 날짜 동당을 봐나 다당 다시 진행을 심하시 되자거래. 저는 그나 왕샤기더랑 거와. 근데 저는 그 시진핑 머신이 딱 오늘 때때도 요리지 막 짜라니 마시와 짜는 로 말이.
Congressman, I agree with you that since China is an authoritarian state, there's nothing that Xi Jinping doesn't really know, except maybe 1 or 2 things.
근데 된다다 소대나 나 니동자가로라고 다도 호진도니까 내가 중앙강 중앙강가 소리가 되고는 다도 우인거는 그 지로와 멀거는 그 지로 소 중앙강을 내거다 그래.
In 2008, when I underwent these experiences, Hu Jintao was the head, and Tu Yongkang was there among the 9 members of the Politburo.
티 조용한 가릴라 버진에 다와식 나라 레카 참마 찾고지 뭐 참마가 까잖아 까자 링고지 공자데 다 모다 년도와 레콘리라 모다 소마 짜요 다 다지 다와식 나뭐 참마가 가나네 레카 레고지 공지까지도 조용한 거랑 걸라버리.
And Tu Yongkang, who was holding the security position there, he mentioned that all issues had to be completed in 1 month, which meant many things. And officers were given facilities like 3 cars to undertake those actions.
티컬레 나르체톤데 소가 나르체톤데 유덴투제레 야미소리 유덴투.
So at that time, the official who was torturing me was a Chinese official named Yu Dentu.
니통 약로코 던낙 총장자 뭐 던곡 레셰 그뭐 던건 거탄스 뭐 던거탄스 고안로 뭐 년도와
He was the head of a 7-member unit.
가상대랑나 고 종그 종혼 진도와 광시산.
Right now, he has now been promoted to being a head of a county.
콘치도 시지즈다 콘치도 코르급자 담선제거든요. 대대지나 공리야를 마시사 싸워라는 로요 말.
Therefore, with situations like this, there's nothing that all officials in China would not know.
장첸은 바근데 레카데 야고지치 동 다치 나르초다 다초 강라강조 당데 장첸은 바가 레체테서 동양아야는 로거리. 동다 종은 바가테서 야라 커토간 로거리. 커는 바가 레체테서 시지 그런 바테는 전에 장첸은 로거다요. 덴지 좀 레시 가네포 그런 바테 시지 코랑 레카 당는 로거리. 더 싸워라니 동양 그 마코사 싸워라니 로거 말.
Therefore, it looks like that people who commit these tortures and who commit these crimes seem to get promoted from one level, from the prefecture level to the provincial, from provincial to upper up, like this. So that indicates that the officials at all levels are knowing of things.
니통자kel 로에나가 동양이 말아 police 다뭐 가시서 영어를 konsuinara 다가랑 베진이 말아 영어를 다 konsu 창마가 그 레카다 너 나초 당노도 창마 konsu 시월에.
Just to give you a case in point, in 2008, among those coming to investigate me were some police people sent directly from Beijing by the central government.
근데 되니지랬더니 저다 재미 나르체 동당 재미 딱다다 엄마 나버서 송고도 그 재미 대화 제상다 뒤당내나 재미 대화 제나 여고다 메다죠 되니 송송 다 재미를 예치 싸라니 제요 말은 탑동랑래 konsu 가자 참마 전발에 다 도스게냐 나중 고고 그 냠들 잘 송송디 당갑잡정디 konsu 참마 란 싸라니 말죠 냠들 잘 속고 티건데 고고 나중 고고를 그 냠집 파티죠 저와 산는 땅아리 저와 산는 땅나 다른 konsu 갈라우리 나저 동바도 동바 트니까 제요 konsu 갈라우리 짝급적 다다 요제 짝급적 때 konsu zonle che saarani mans to zomba teso taji karse kar denja ka cheta konsu pechi cheyos te maza taron zomba teso ti chak kapchak tang joko de kap ondong ka lang chi nyengo ro teni joko yos ta nga dawa tendi mambo je la chak kapchak da nyam de danne konsu narche tang re tendi ngo domba da ngo thidali chakzen teri lawre tene chere janak chamsa padeso konsu chamra nane konsu 측대에서 토마도가 좀 공치 첨서 바자라는 좀 메시 볼라 차서 좀 맞지 싸라는 메시 냠들 잔속 땅은 던지 그 따진 거 작전들이 라고 번능나다 다가 예미까지 나가서 거 땅 거요 따 작전라 왕이 그 던지지 내려 그래 냠들 잔속 나는 던지 작전 라서 내일 싸라는 맨 내적 잔악 그 섬지 소르길렘도 대 총총 말이 던지지 그 땅에 난 잠이 지가차다 측대서 나와 그 지자 랑네 제만도 양 공시 남절 여고로 왔나 디지라 손의 대지 다양 시지와 말이야 대진제로 한도서 바로.
Right now, there was a discussion about whether we should trust the Chinese or have some hope in the Chinese thing. From what I've experienced, I don't have any basis of hope. For example, at the United Nations Committee Against Torture session in November, where I attended, there were 39-member delegation from China, and in their talk, they mentioned that there was the tiger chair that Sophie mentioned earlier, that and I had mentioned earlier, was not a torture instrument, but was meant for safety and protection of the detainees. Protection because it will help them not prevent wounds on their backside. So they also said there are no political prisoners in China. They said there are no lawyers are being detained. So all these, in the face of the fact that I was there who underwent torture, who was very much present in that room, and they were telling these lies. So that doesn't give me any hope.
그러지래. 근데 다시 차서 좀 마시가 미세 그래. 딱 아르가 냠집 지어래. 아르가 두개다 집지서 냠집 지어래. 다더니 로미 토탕 좀 베지 때니까 보그 다른 살라래 거기 그 동자가 니다 자치 작식 장이 된지 지어래. 다때서는 텐디가 다 잡서 좀 마가 잠깐 마시고 망보지 요래 지금 차서 좀 미세 싸워라는 로가 말이 이토 냥토 망보지 땅다 요래. 텐디가 내리 싸워라는 진사면의 작전들이 랍고
Even in the case, if you talk about political prisoners, the CECC itself has a list of around 640 names of Tibetan political prisoners. The Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy in Dharamsala has more than 1,000 names. So all these are political prisoners, and the Chinese have the guts to say that there are no political prisoners.
근데 남아서나 본능 앞에 당마이나 본능 잠나서 불러서도 냠도 본능을 하사 했더니지 보그 내땅의 참마 somsion나들이 지는 문이라네나 본 뭐뭔가 본능나 다당 파에 다 본나만 되어지는 참마 고도 참마라 고급이었나 저런 거 투지체 본 뭐뭔가 잡지는 투지체제로 치지 망보지 그때니 라고도 되는 대랑 고급도 배 언니 고급이 호서 남아 소나요리 대라지 냥 터바네요 다지고 본 뭐뭔가 잡지니 투지체제하던
I'm glad that Congressman Waltz is over here, and you mentioned about your trip to Tibet. In our interaction with people in Tibet, we knew that they knew about your trip to Tibet, and they were very much pleased that you were able to do with Leader Nancy Pelosi. And they said that if you get that opportunity to please thank you all on their behalf.
근데 단 남아서나 다지 냠이 요리지다 대처 참마시그래 다 가시냐 냠 버거 내땅데 사오서 마신 다지 즉전 요제다 정치가 게모즈 단데 다든 즉전 제정 폐지에 당서 그러지네 다티까지도 제정네 살아요네 다 실로가 요네 양지 다 가르저거는 폐지에 당서가 즉전 배 식진 못 당서 그러지 가서지 반발에 노바체네 되니 방보자 남아서나 다 버거 내땅 참마좀 캠베 대들 방보 지어리 대나 소소 마음바이나 멈턴네 보그 내땅 사찰한 로야다 보 뭐뭔가 샘는 거 까자 뭐마데 나바서 식산 타야 되다 보 뭐뭔가라 레바스 제거를 나랑라 보 잡서 좀마서 임비차는 거라 대 레바스 식침보 제거요.
The Chinese will continue to hold on to their positions like about development in Tibet and progress in Tibet, etc. But I believe that it's important that we continue to engage with them and to hold on to, and to try to sort of understand the real situation in Tibet, whether it's going to Tibet or meeting people who will really be able to provide the real information about things relating to Tibet.
내려와지 본 뭐뭔가 레바 배식 침보 가르치 제거래 사산에 다 정섭 강직 지금은 망보지 준소나래 당만에 당 망보자라 당가서 본능 나오디 년데 다대 산제절 망보지라 대다 본 뭐뭐 창마가 칼상 때랑나 딱대 가르치 제거나 고성세 당가 실로다요래 대 저런 거 뒤걸 때도 지금 즉타고였답니다 다지 시험베디네 랍고래 다신 맨니 얘기 메신에 로바드에서 알아지디 아리 선선 지금 망하다 아리 준속한 속소다 따뜻이 망하다 하르치스 시기도 그래 덴디지 리와 침보드 제어는 하산이 정섭강 양락 스가데 다 망보스 배식자고 대라 마음바나 가리나 지금 득탑고 연나 맨나 지금 다 가르티틱 제나 대 멈턴데 지금 다 식자고다 지금 망망가 잡지네 못 그러다
I want to say this, and this is something that while I was in Tibet, I was aware of it, and while I'm outside, I'm more aware of this issue. And this is the issue about opening a U.S. consulate in Lhasa. The Tibetan people have great expectation, great hope that something like this would happen because they know that the United States can do something, if at all any country can do, on the Tibetan issue. This is the voice that I hear from the Tibetan intellectuals. This is the voice that I even hear from Tibetan nomads who may not know many things, but they will know that there are some American leaders who care about Tibet.
근데 다른 엄마 식송송 다시는 선전다 선전가 완내 가셔야다 문이랑 같이 모르자 땅가나 아메리카가 선전 망보시당 땅가랑 본나오디를 시고리 딱가 가성되는 거 선전 레토와 오바마리 다 당니고 선전데 대나 더 땅보 선전 오바마 다 선전라 톰니 야나간 삼석 갑딜라 다 로약 하사가 로약데 로탁자지 첨탁자지 소토가 땅자고 띠갑딜 띠갑딜라 가서 딱 뽑아 모스가 따딜라 딱 문이 샘식 첨보다네 따당 오바마 야나가 뵙고 톡당보리 딱 로약가 소과라지 몇째리 삽니다 가서 빼려 첨보도 제리 딱 델라지 오바마 문데네 간차 특식 맛이 봐지네 차팅 지가 맛이야지네 지용할 딱 문이 장전다 스승부터 다다 후진도 로미 톱당당네 가서 이렇게 좀 가까이서 당 따더니 지지야다 가서 문이 따당이나 로약가 따지 셔진데라 오바마 문이 까차직 람마송서 나 따로라 직대라지
Loyas, Lobsan Dendir.
로약제 로약제 코랑 망따로 로약 로토가 당으로 덴디제나 디캅데나 다때 마음바이나 당가서 지 엄마 선전 아르 선전 망보지 그다 선전은 상식 당보텔라 차진 죽돈니 차서 좀 말은 이런 망보지 되어래 뭐 가지 땅야 땅 뭐 가지 로 제용화 땅야 다때 그 선전대서는 다때나 대라 지금 양 대랑 다때 디까지 나가나 대라 지금 가랑 송원이나 지금 양 오바마가 선전 오바마 뭐랑 것도네나 지금 로로 펌시 보여 마인베 아미죠 아메리카 조망 니차 문이 장에 본 마망라다 가디나 잡혀던 특허 첨보나 준속래나 저거 다다 마샤베네 다점 거는 뭐저 셀 것도 막 보여가라 소화 같더니 문이 장에 빼 첨보 저 마음반에 대당 땜성 거 가서 잡혀로 나오고 나지 다 지금 못 걸었던 리아지시에
The United States is a country that bestowed the Congressional Gold Medal to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and its leaders have always cared about Tibet. And although I respect President Obama as individual, when he went to China for the first time in 2009, I had expected that he would raise certain specific cases about the Tibetans, particularly about a Tibetan prisoner called Loyak. But unfortunately, nothing like that happened. And that is a sort of a disappointment that I continue to have about the president's trip. Now that very soon the United States, there will be a new president, I hope that whenever a new president goes on a maiden trip to China, there should be some benchmarks, some conditions, etc., that should lead to such a visit. Otherwise, it will not be. It might lead to disappointment for some people.
된다 마음 다 탐이 이통네 저 골급대에 못 거지요. 다뭐그 접서 좀 마당 좀 마대 좀 초된 거 통네 자와로 내려고 말 텔라지가 그 자친 지향 매비다님 초된다 맘치고 통네 잡혀 나오고 tani tan nana dawa tukbi the chergi ni malang tanga penja chuji jezo te kum khama chamba chama na pare ta loksik har cher ko ko ne ko la man chigam tho yam wo man ya chigam tho yo mare te dang tem song ta chazu so ma te zo na tang ni hang sawa ka karson da kan ka chong ori te tam chorteng ta ne na chachin jang me bi ta ne tam chorteng ko shok de la jap chor na no
and I listen to the discussion about providing relief to survivors of torture. And I also think that the former political prisoners or political prisoners also need such assistance. And I would appreciate if that can be considered too. For example, I have a relative, Choki, who is in Tibet there, who hasn't who was detained on June 19th. And although the physical condition is not good, hasn't received any medical treatments in the hands of the Chinese. And I want to end by reiterating one of the recommendations that it's in my written statement. And I care deeply about my colleague Thundup Wangchen, with whom we made this film together. He's still in Tibet. His family, wife and children are in the United States. His parents are in India. So I would like for any steps that you can take to enable the family reunification.
Tene ta nagjon tsompa po rangwa tsompa po jorjang nana dawa sambe tse chirgi nima de la zamre zamne dawa cheers gwa de nga tsuwa tsawa ne kangna yu shiwa mar te ta kharsan kini ngama da dawa di ngama ngazala yana ka changdi ma be chamra tsone ko lo sam ko lo tak che ko lo sam ko lo tak de ku ngulin tsawa ran de chiwa mar ko ro mi top tang da ko marjo rangwa da tsomre rangwa ko 강국제 상황에 로드랑 와라 간이 강국제 엔지마 쿠야나 까 첨서 첨거 래 같이가 리미다 까 가상 때라디 희적도 그 이차대야 야라 다가서 거래 뒤땅라 남바 충분히 마음바 다지 야나 거 홍보래 나 저거 정당 섭에 나 저거 뒤땅라 조정 로터 땅하다 조정 그 다지 첨서대나 남성 용어 체다 남바 수이나다 접결 식체 보나는 거나지
I also want to raise the case of another Tibetan prisoner, Shokchang, who is a blogger, writer, and he has been sentenced to 3 years, but he has denied all the charges that the authorities have leveled against him, and he has in fact written a strong denial about all the charges, and I would appreciate anything that you can do about his case.
테네다 지나바다 니동 정하가 르돔 나가사라 나오진 다 원는 거 산고 바당 다 랑왕담비 다 지금 시험배대래 테네 다 절급고 말나 준속 말나 대소이나 보다 철진정함에 비고네 다 지금 뼈도 바당 워크 샘는 거 샘삼비 땅 가샤디 바 렌트와데 디땅라 잡혀 나오나지.
And I want to conclude by requesting members of this commission as well as journalists and others, independent individuals, to consider visiting Tibet and to understand the real situation of the people there. Thank you so much.
I'm going to add a really quick lever, a possible realm to your list. There's an organization called the Rhodium Group that put out a great report earlier this week about FDI from the mainland in the U.S. And I want to be clear, investment's good, jobs are good. This is not an objection. But I think there are a lot of questions to be asked about, especially if that investment is coming from state-owned enterprises, who those enterprises are, and if there are opportunities to press for improvements through those back onto the Chinese government as a condition of their having access here in the U.S. So I'm just going to toss that out to you.
我希望透过这个会议呢，就是再关注一下法轮功学员就是逃亡到泰国的这个150多位难民吧。
Through this meeting, I would like to also express my concern about another 160 Falun Gong practitioner refugees now in Thailand.
在泰国这150多个法轮功学员，他们的生存状态现在非常的危急。
As far as I know, their condition in Thailand is not very good. Actually, in a lot of danger.
由于就是在泰国这个身份问题，就是被抓进移民监的法轮功学员呢，他们不准于被担保。他们说，法轮功学员在泰国不允许担保的原因是来自于中共的压力。
And those practitioners in Thailand already been told by the area that confines them that they cannot be moved forward because the pressure was from the Chinese government.
他们泰国的法轮功学员在那里边申难呢，第一次面谈现在被延迟到3年，或者2年，就是这样一个状况。然后
Yeah, their interviews with the United Nations for refugee status cannot be go through directly. It has to wait for at least 3 years in Thailand.
泰国的法律是不允许工作。那么现在流亡到泰国这些法轮功学员呢，他们的生存状态就非常危急了。
And another problem is Thailand government do not allow them to work in Thailand. So for this 3-year waiting period, how are they going to survive?
最近呢就有9名，就是有2名法轮功学员，还有7位民运的，他们在这种环境下被迫就是买船，然后在想通过海上就是逃亡到第3国家。那现在呢，我们有一个法轮功学员呢，就是现在被他们就是扣押在泰国的警局里边。
And then I heard recently there were 9 people, including some Falun Gong practitioners. They couldn't stay in such a condition, so they tried to escape and found a boat. Then unfortunately the boat was wrecked. And now they were all arrested by the police in Thailand.
昨天晚上我跟他的太太有一个沟通，然后他的太太告诉我，就是他的先生在泰国警局里边有中共进去求他的护照。
As a matter of fact, yesterday she just called one of the person's wife, and the wife told Ms. In that her husband already now in the custody of Thailand police. But then Chinese government already sent somebody to get this gentleman's passport.
他的妻子昨天连夜给我赶了一份这个事件的报告，然后今天早晨我们急着把它打出来，今天我把它呈现到这个会议。
So during that time, and the wife just sent Ms. In this statement about the case in Thailand about her husband. So she would like to also submit to the committee for help.
谢谢。
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses. I'd like to thank our staff, Jen Stalin, Andy Wong, Scott Flipsey, Elise Anderson, Judy Wright, Dee Jackson, and Paul Prodek, who's the Chief of Staff, for their work, not just for this hearing and our series of hearings that we've been holding, but for the work that they do every day on this vital information, trying to convey it both to China, to our other parts of our government, including the executive branch, and of course, for working so diligently on the Human Rights Report, the annual report, that lays bare the record, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and sadly, so much of it has been ugly of late. I want to thank them for that as well. Let me conclude also. Thank you, guys. Let me also just conclude by, again, reminding everybody that the Chinese government told the committee, the Convention Against Torture, as Randy Holtgren said so well, quote, government acts of intimidation and reprisals against citizens do not exist in China. That is a big lie, and it needs to be so denounced as that. And then to say, as it was pointed out in our testimony, that tiger chairs are utilized for the safety and comfort of women and men who are being interrogated and tortured is absolutely absurd. The hearing is adjourned.